Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us. I don't have any excuse for not speaking well, so I hope you can all understand me. And I especially appreciate those who are joining us who perhaps don't have English as their first language. So I'll try to speak clearly. This presentation will last about 30 minutes to be followed by a question and answer session where you can all get involved. As mentioned, Danielle will be doing a few polls during the presentation to get your anonymous views on specific questions, the answers to which we'll share in real time. Making sure we have ethical leaders running our organizations, be it government, big corp, SMEs, charities, education, or NGOs, has to be a priority for the 21st century. The consequences of the lack of ethical leadership are in the news headlines virtually every day. Whether it is the leaders of major countries or organizations accused of tax evasion, negligence, misrepresentations, bribery, money laundering, financial manipulation, etc., etc. Policymakers and legislators seem to be at a loss of what to do, other than come up with new sticking plaster rules and regulations that lawyers and accountants then find ways around. And the populace is angry, resulting in populist and idealistic politicians coming to the fore and extreme political parties gaining ground. It all seems quite a mess and quite frightening. But actually, the fact that many more misdeeds are coming to light demonstrates a positive underlying development that is the result of the information and internet age we are living in. In the 20th century and earlier, organizations were much more easily able to hide their law-breaking and unethical behavior. Slowly, very slowly, there is a realization that fundamental changes need to take place. More than anything else, we need a new kind of leadership. Although it's important to briefly explain and define in this session what we mean by ethical leadership, there are two other areas that require much more debate and development. One is, why do we need ethical leadership? And especially, how do we develop ethical leaders? Unless we actually develop the leaders that can implement an embedded ethical way of operating within organizational cultures, the whole subject becomes a purely academic and unrealizable exercise. Today, the overwhelming focus to solving our ethical problems are around process and structure, focusing on compliance. These processes tend not to deal with values and behavior, even though the only way that people will comply in the spirit rather than the letter is where they use their values to ensure they behave ethically. The result, not only in today's world, but since ancient times, is that it is morally acceptable to play the game by ticking the boxes while circumventing the rules. This is exemplified by the attitude of professional advisors around the world who hide behind compliance to the rules to undermine ethical behavior. As someone who received his university degree in chemical engineering and spent most of his career in international business, I've come to realize that sometimes a logical and analytically trained brain like mine has its drawbacks. And the thinking needs to be balanced by feeling and being. That is, actions need to be underpinned by behaviors and values. To develop and maintain ethical organizations, we need what we call transpersonal leaders. No need to try to read the detail on this slide. We'll be sending you the presentation. Transpersonal leaders operate beyond their ego, continuing personal development and learning. They are radical, ethical, authentic, while emotionally intelligent and caring. So ethical leadership is a core element of what we call transpersonal leadership and sits alongside radical, authentic, caring, and performance enhancing as its key purposes. Ethical leadership is one of those things that most of us know is important, but where there are very few methodologies on how it can be achieved, or examples of how it has actually been realized in organizations. The English language, being what it is, contains many words that have different meanings depending on the context or who you ask. So it is with ethics. The big confusion is between the words ethics and morals. One reputable reference can define them exactly the opposite of another. So we need to define what these words mean in our discussion on ethical leadership. Ethical behavior is acting in a way that is consistent with one's own principles and values, which are characterized by honesty, fairness, and equity in all interpersonal activities, be they personal or professional, and by respecting the dignity, diversity, and rights of individuals and groups of people. Moral behavior, on the other hand, are the rules of conduct of any group or society, which may differ from one to another, but are based on conviction rather than proven evidence, and which may or may not be ethical, as in the definition above. So in essence, ethical behavior is of a higher order than moral behavior, and this is very important for any leader operating in a culture, be it a country or organization, where what is accepted morally is not ethical in the view of that individual. Just think about how capital punishment or gay rights are treated in different societies and what your view is and how might you need to act. We also need to define the following in order to be able to communicate accurately. Ethical organizations. These can be defined as ones that have a culture that considers the implications of what they are doing and the effect it might have on all their stakeholders. And let's define leadership. It's usually a process which involves influencing others and happens within the context of a group. Leadership involves goal attainment, and these goals are shared by leaders and their followers. Our experience suggests that leading oneself is an important first step in the journey, in which an individual just needs to face and overcome fear to take the initiative and act. So we can therefore define ethical leadership as here the process of influencing people to act through principles and values and beliefs that embrace what we have defined as ethical behavior. The Western literature on ethical leadership generally refers to the 5 principles which can be traced back to Aristotle. They are respect and service to others, justice for others, honesty towards others, and building community with others. The words trip easily off the tongue, but they are extremely difficult to always put into practice. So as I'm sure you've noticed, these principles are all about how the individual deals with others. The key criterion to be able to actually live these principles is to operate beyond the ego, to put others first. As a contrast, let's look at Confucianism, which is based on Ren, Yi, and Li, which means compassion, rightness, and customs of proper conduct. In actual fact, these sort of cover Aristotle's list, but noticeably add compassion. The driver for our personal ego are power, prestige, recognition, and reward. And it's worth learning which of these most drives our own egos. The natural one for me is recognition, which I do continually work on curbing. Which one is the one that drives you and perhaps needs managing? Is it power, prestige, recognition, or reward? Try and think about which one has the most impact on you and the way you live your life and your leadership. Organizational leaders will always face a conflict between making decisions for one's own benefit compared to the good of the organization and its stakeholders. Within your organization, is there an order of priority of whom you consider the most important stakeholder, or does it depend on the circumstances? Recently, I was with the 20 senior officials of the Ministry of Education of a country I won't name. They were asked to write down the top 2 stakeholders for the ministry and hand in their paper for consolidation. When we looked at the figures, between them, they had 11 different priority stakeholders, and children were only mentioned 4 times. I'm sure we can repeat this kind of situation in many organizations.
This is about the importance you believe your organization places on ethical behavior as compared to commercial success. Now, as you'll see, we're in a very fortunate position that the vast majority feel that commercial success and ethical behavior are either equally important or that ethical behavior is at the heart of their organizations. So that is a really nice result to have. So I'd like to run straight on quickly to the second poll, which is about your own sense of ethics. And this is about how you reconcile your ethics and those of your organization. So as you will see, again, we have the largest number who feel their ethics and those of the organization are aligned and healthy, but regrettably almost equal results between feeling impelled to speak out or considered leaving due to an ethical conflict. Again, happily, the 2 better results seem to be the highest ones. So thank you very much for that participation. We really appreciate it. And I will hand back to John now.
Yeah, that was very interesting. I'm sure that if we took an average cross-section across all organizations, the the profile would be somewhat different than that. So obviously there's quite a large percentage of people who are luckily in organizations where that are quite high on the ethical profile. So let's moving along. So identifying the most important stakeholders for an organization is often heavily influenced by unconscious bias. It requires a really mature and high level of decision making and judgment, which goes beyond rational thinking, and requires effective use of subconscious and unconscious neural processes of intuition, instinct, and insight, as well as a sound personal ethical philosophy. This approach is vital to be an ethical leader. In one important area, we live in a different world to Aristotle, Plato, Confucius, and all the other revered ancient sages. They lived in a world of extreme hierarchy, and ultimately, they always honored and respected their leader, who felt the moral obligation and expectation to make all decisions. But to expect the leader to always come to the best solution alone is unrealistic, especially in our modern complex world. Today, hierarchy is disappearing as leadership depends less on hereditary, victory, power, and unavailable knowledge. Just over the last 20 years, we've not only seen the arrival of the information age, but also huge global societal change, which is continuing to break down barriers. Look at the key influences: the internet, communication, information, globalization, technology, and societal change. The consequence of all this is that people are becoming more equal as human beings, even though this change is still very slow, particularly in many cultures, and the modern celebrity culture actually fights against this. Also counter to this trend towards equality is the growing wealth gap between the super rich and the rest. For example, between 2004 and 2014, the number of US dollar billionaires tripled to over 1,600, according to Forbes magazine, with the number from the emerging world growing from 20% to 43% of the total during the same period. Some of these billionaires are the result of the rapid growth of large companies, especially in Asia. but others are the result of cronyism. Each will no doubt have their own story of ethical behavior to tell. So I would add a sixth principle: human equality. This does not mean we have to be equal in our roles or in our living standard or in our salaries, but just being equal as human beings will inevitably reduce the extremes of excess and poverty which themselves are drivers for unethical behavior. We should treat those at the bottom of society's hierarchy with the same dignity, respect, fairness, and honesty as we do at the top. Maybe think janitor versus the Queen of England. Both our ego and our emotions, especially fear, need managing to be able to overcome this instinctive tendency. The hero and celebrity culture gets in the way of this. The impact of this change is that anyone can and should look to be a leader wherever they are in the organization. Leadership is becoming more distributed, more informal, more shared. In this context, on the one hand, the role of senior ethical leaders is pivotal, and on the other, every single employee should be thinking of themselves as an ethical leader. This can only be achieved by creating an ethical culture. The role of the ethical leader is not just about values and principles, but also about behaviors. A recent personal experience explains why. Recently, on a business trip to India, I met the CEO of a major insurance company. He was an extremely intelligent and urbane man who had studied at Harvard and was interested in developing the next generation of leaders in their organization. He was keen to better engage the people in the organization, bearing in mind there was a high turnover of staff. He wanted to genuinely improve customer service and was keen to increase the involvement of the organization in the communities where they operated. All very good values and principles. After about 15 minutes into our conversation, he phoned the HR director, who he'd spoken highly about, and told us she would be interested in what we were discussing and to come to the meeting right away. She arrived soon after, but was obviously not able to concentrate, perhaps because she'd been taken away from something that she considered very important. Now, coincidentally, during the same trip, I met the very mature CEO of a manufacturing organization in the energy sector, who had very similar leadership issues. And after about 15 minutes or so, he phoned the HR manager. The HR director happened to be away on a visit, and asked him how he was, and explained that I was visiting and talking about leadership development in the organization and thought he might be interested to attend if he was available, although realized he should have informed him earlier. After a few seconds of listening, the CEO said to the HR manager that he understood. It was important that he attended the other meeting that had been arranged and would brief him later. They were both ethical leaders in their intent of service, justice, and honesty, but one of them did not match up on the principles of respect and human equality through their behavior. This very simple yet important lesson demonstrates that a good intellect and good values alone are not sufficient to be a good ethical leader. Often what is lacking in real life situations are the appropriate behaviors. So why do we need ethical leaders? It may seem obvious, but one that needs answering because of the evidence of the misdeeds of national leaders and large corporations as discussed earlier. And think of all those that we don't know about yet. This brief case study provides a good reason why. Working with a major division of a global multinational recently, the CEO was very keen to develop and embed an ethical culture for the long-term success of the organization, especially as they were becoming increasingly global with operations in different countries, which had a variety of moral codes. In a session with the senior leadership team, we asked the question, why do you think being an ethical company is important for your organization? The response was the list shown here. Then we asked the question, and how many of these are good for business? The somewhat surprised answer was, they all are. The problem is there's a strong default mentality in the corporate world that at the crux, business needs, success and competitiveness override ethical concerns. The example above alone gives 14 reasons why we fundamentally disagree with this and believe that in the 21st century, good ethics is increasingly important for a successful, sustainable business. An additional reason for our views comes from a recent global study by IBM comparing the demands of different generations, which found that millennials, that's people between the age of 24 and 37 today, regard fairness and ethics in the workplace even more important than recognition and opportunity. This is a real shift. And bear in mind that many millennials are today both followers and young leaders, and they will become the next generation of senior leaders. So now for the really difficult and most important question. How do we develop ethical leaders? The fundamental key is to increase values to a higher level of consciousness and to raise their awareness of how their behavior impacts the performance of themselves and the people around them. A core problem is that although most people fundamentally have good values and a real sense of what is right and wrong, organizations tend to ignore these traits when identifying future leaders. Instead, they favor traditional leadership characteristics, self-confidence, assertiveness, influence, and achievement, which without the good values to temper them can regress to things like high ego, aggression, manipulation, and ruthlessness, and an obsession for total control. It's therefore not surprising that 1 in 25 CEOs are considered psychopathic, 4 times higher than the general population. And some researchers put it as high as 1 in 5 leaders are psychopathic. Personally, I'd use the term sociopathic to describe these undesirable behaviors, as sociopaths can be empathetic and caring to those with whom they have a very close bond. Even those with good basic values have most often been taught in their organizations to leave values and ethics at the front door when you come to work. During my life, I've come across many people who could have become excellent organizational leaders, but were either not good at getting to the top, that is, they didn't always put themselves first, or were not willing to make the ethical compromises. Organizations must change and start identifying leaders that will be the right kind of leader when they get there, not just effective at climbing to the top. I think you're going to do another poll now, Danielle.
This poll is about how your organization goes about developing ethical leaders. And you can see that it's fairly evenly split between organizations that focus on performance but not values or ethics, and organizations that touch on values and ethics. And there are some of you, which is good news and a good sign for the future, that run specific courses and integrated programs that focus a lot on values and ethics. So there's another very interesting result. Thank you very much for your participation. And back to you, John.
Okay, thank you. Well, it's interesting that I think I counted at about a third of the respondents had some real focus on ethics and values in their leadership development. And up to 50% had touched on it at least, but there were at least half where there was no reference to ethics and values in leadership development. Okay, so moving on. So to look at some of the basics about how we identify and develop ethical leaders, we need to consider the hierarchy of intelligences. The first level of intelligence is the intellectual, our rational and logical thinking. The neural processes that enable this are through serial connections that are hardwired. To a large extent, our potential intellectual capacity is fixed from birth, although most of us never reach anywhere near our capacity. The second level is emotional intelligence, which manage our emotions and impact our feelings and behaviors. The neural connections that enable this intelligence are associative. That means billions of neurocells are loosely connected, but desirable connections can be strengthened through practice and repetition. This is often referred to as the plasticity of the brain. The highest level of intelligence is spiritual, which includes ethical, which manages, amongst other things, how we activate our values. Spiritual intelligence also has a unique way for our neurons to connect, known as synchronous oscillations. First discovered only in 1989, every neuron in the localized part of the brain involved emits oscillations in harmony and unison in the 40 Hertz range. Raising one's level of consciousness, for example, through mindfulness exercises, activates this mechanism. So let's look at how these intelligences and the method of neural connections affect the ethical leadership. To be an excellent leader, one does need a certain level of intellect, but an IQ anything more than 15% above the norm makes no difference to the likelihood of success as a leader. So whereas a reasonable intellect is a threshold necessity to becoming an excellent leader, it is not sufficient and certainly does not guarantee any competence in ethical leadership as such. Having passed that threshold, the one thing anyone would accept is vital to be a good ethical leader is having good values, which involves the highest level of intelligence. However, we really need to investigate which values are critical for ethical leadership. Leadershaper has developed a model that divides values into two separate categories. Those that define personal conscience, that is, who I am, and those that can be categorized as self-determination, that is, what am I going to do with who I am, particularly important for leaders. The most common desired values for leaders to possess, as cited by employees, are trustworthiness, integrity, honesty, and excellence, as shown in red. And this is common on many surveys around the world. But to be an ethical leader, it is also necessary to specifically develop the softer personal conscience values such as fairness, forgiveness, and altruistic love, as well as the self-determination values of purpose, courage, and resilience, for example. This can only be achieved by the leader raising their level of consciousness so that a true understanding of each key value is used as a touchstone in every decision made. This takes time, practice, and commitment, but can be achieved. The more it's done, the easier it becomes. If we look at the list shown on this slide, each of us, if we can be honest to ourselves, can probably immediately choose a couple of values we personally have most challenges with in demonstrating. Take a moment to choose a couple for yourself. Perhaps write them down. For how to address these, let's look at fairness as an example. If we break down fairness into 4 granular statements, it suddenly becomes more manageable. To treat everyone on an equal basis, appoints and promotes those best suited for the job, helps people to learn from genuine mistakes, supports those affected negatively by personal and family pressures. The best practical way for a leader to bring a full armory of values into their everyday working lives is to carry out a 360-degree values assessment, such as Leadershaper's 8 ICOL, and identify which of the core values the individual leader and the people around them believe are the core strengths and development needs. Building these values through their granular components into a touchstone for every decision made and action taken is a key step to developing into an ethical leader. Here is my touchstone as an example. On the right-hand side in green are the overriding qualities of a transpersonal leader, which we all need. On the left-hand side are my most important personal core values. After a while, it becomes second nature and in the subconscious, and we will only need to use our touchstone explicitly, that is by bringing it to full consciousness, when we have a difficult choice to make. But it's a very valuable tool. So, unexpectedly, the key intelligence that is most important to successfully becoming an ethical leader is actually the second level, that of emotional intelligence. The combination of thinking, intellect, and being, spiritual, is useless as a leader unless they are translated into behaviors. And behaviors are the outcome of how we manage our emotions. The story comparing the two Indian leaders I explained earlier exemplifies this. The right behaviors can be learned, but this is only achieved as a result of the individual leader becoming more aware of how their behaviors impact not only their own performance, but also the performance of the people around them. Just think of the example of the chief executive of the insurance company. He not only caused the HR director to be ineffective during the meeting, but also ruined whatever else she was trying to accomplish when interrupted. And this may have impacted her overall performance for some time after the event due to the negative emotions caused. The way we recommend leaders identify which behaviors they need to improve is by carrying out an emotional intelligence and leadership 360, such as Leadershaper's Leaper. That identifies how they and their close network both observe and would desire their behavior to be, and can thus isolate a few granular behaviors that will have the greatest impact on the leader's performance. And our research shows that 1 or 2 or 3 granular behaviors change will make all the difference in a leader's performance. Working either in a facilitated team or with a personal coach, or even better, a combination of the two, can lead to those fundamentally good values becoming excellent ethical leaders. If you'd like to do a self-assessment of your own emotional intelligence, why not try the Leadershaper app? It's free and it's on Google Play or the Apple Store. You can test your own emotional intelligence in confidence, or you can share with a colleague, even more valuable. And for $2 or $3 or pounds, you can check your leadership styles too. And finally, this is perhaps the biggest danger for a leader. Everyone thinks of changing the world, but no one thinks of changing themselves. Although I hope if Tolstoy was in the 21st century, he would have included women in that statement. It is so much easier to focus on how others need to change, or on changing strategy or amending organizational models. But excellent leaders always focus first on developing themselves. If enough organizations embrace this approach to choose the right future leaders for development, we would be on our way to a better world from everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, John. I'm just going to give you a little brief overview about our transpersonal journey, and also give you the opportunity to look more deeply into this with some references. And also to ask you what you think about what you've heard so far. So in this webinar, we've given you a glimpse of how to become an ethical and a transpersonal leader. This diagram describes the complete journey, which of course never ends, because it's my belief that we are ethically authentic at some times, and perhaps at difficult times in our lives, perhaps slide back a little way. So it is a journey that never ends and that we are always striving for. But we can help, and people can undertake this journey over a period of between 6 and 24 months on a conscious level. if they wish to do it intensively. In a moment, we'll start a Q&A session, so do start sending in your questions now and we will respond to those. But first, I'd like to inform you very briefly about some resources for further information and run one final poll. So I will run that last poll and launch that now, asking you what you think about what you've heard about our approach to developing ethical leadership. And then I will move on to show you some of the additional resources that we have for you. So thank you very much for that feedback. That's obviously very, very important for us, and to know that what we're saying makes sense to you and builds on what are clearly some very strong ethical values that those of you attending this webinar have indicated through your answers to our other polls. So to find out more about transpersonal leadership, these publications are available. The Invisible Elephant is available free of charge, and it's our initial overview of the transpersonal journey. And you simply have to contact Leadershaper to obtain a copy from us in a PDF format. Use the link, or please feel free to contact John or myself directly. Leadership Assessment for Talent Development is available from Amazon and other bookstores, online bookstores, including the publishers bookstore, but Amazon for most people is the easiest way. But your local equivalent of Amazon will have that available undoubtedly as well. As I said at the outset of this webinar, we have published a series of white papers which have been circulated and disseminated through Routledge, and there is a new one due in September and a further one in December, and we will hope to have webinars to explore these topics over the coming months. And you're able to obtain these white papers by clicking on the links as the web links show below in the slide, and again you will have those in the printout in the PDF of the slides that you'll be sent following the end of the webinar. So you'll be able to take any of the web links from that. Next, why not join us on Wednesday the 13th of September for the inaugural Washington Ethical Leadership Summit, which is hosted in partnership with Virginia International University and the University of Chester, which is also sponsored by Routledge. The event is for diverse business leaders, where the coaches, academics, writers, and other thought leaders who are interested in improving the ethics of leadership in a pragmatic and effective way. And of course, having it in Washington is a very powerful message as well. John is a keynote speaker at this event, and it's a one-day event which will include presentations from whistleblowers, lawmakers, and business leaders, as well as a thought-provoking roundtable workshop series. Certificates of completion will be awarded to attendees at the conclusion of the summit. As a part of today's webinar, Routledge are offering a 20% discount on a selection of ethical, sustainability, and leadership titles that we hope you will find of interest based on the content of this webinar. So after the webinar, you can go to the website link shown on the slide, and you will obviously have this on the PDF copy of the slides, and you can purchase any books with a 20% discount. And this discount will be available until the beginning of October. And finally, our new book, Becoming a Transpersonal Leader, which will be published by Routledge in January 2018. This book is a complete, comprehensive manual on how to become a transpersonal leader, including the ethical leadership part. It will be provided to every person who attends a leadership program, which of course we feel is an excellent way to becoming a transpersonal leader. So thank you for that. And I'd just like to open the Q&A session. So we do have some questions that have arisen. Statistically, what is the population of the poll? Are you talking about, answer that by text. We had over 100 people register for the webinar, Max. I hope that Max, we had over 100 people sign up for the webinar. I hope that answers your question. We had an 80+ response. Are there any more questions from anybody on anything that they have heard today? Most of you are still online. John, can I ask you to answer this question from Paul?
From Paul Seans. Hi, Paul. Well, the core reasons given to avoid development of ethical leadership amongst the FTSE 250 organizations from my experience. Well, I think it's the old thing, isn't it, that you know, when it comes to the final decision, that people think that the commercial or monetary short-term solution overrides what's ethical. And I would just say that in today's world, that one has to take into consideration sustainability long-term and the eventual reputation of the organization. In the old days, reputations could be held even though people were acting in an unethical way. But I think it's much more difficult today. Once the news gets out in any small way, it's all over the place. So I think, although I would request that leaders become more conscious of their values, I think they can actually, as a first step, just think of their own self-interest and the organization's self-interest, that there's much higher chance of them getting caught these days. So sometimes the rules and regulations and penalties will help. And I think those penalties, although they're not legal penalties sometimes, but more ones of reputation, I think leaders in those large companies really need to be more careful. I hope that answers the question. To Soraya, how can you develop ethical behaviors in leaders who talk about ethical, but in reality just want to do what they can get away with? It's very difficult. And I think that at some point, and certainly a decision that I made, which sort of ended my corporate life, was that I was in a compromised situation where this was before the internet, I have to say. So there was no opportunity for whistleblowing, and I had to take the personal decision to walk away from that organization. My experience is that if you start on values, it's very complicated and very difficult. But if you start with changing behaviors, it will start to take you on the right path, and the values will fall into place much more easily. So my recommendation would be to look seriously at emotional intelligence. Is there an assessment to measure ethical leadership? Well, we have what's called 8ICOL, which is the 8 integrated competences of leadership, which certainly includes a number of aspects of ethical leadership, which can be measured. And really, it's about going down to the fundamentals. So if you remember the slide I did on fairness, which was just one value, there are 4 statements. And we can get yourself as a self-assessment, or in a 360 environment, we can get people to answer those 4 questions. How often do they observe you following those specific behaviors, and how often would they desire that you follow those behaviors, and measure the difference? And if there is a difference, that's a particular granular behavior you can work on. With same system for emotional intelligence. So we're looking at how do we move from how people observe us to how people would desire to observe us. And we identify the specific granular areas where there's the biggest difference and focus on those. Is there any proven correlation between ethical leadership and good governance? I'm not aware, to be quite honest, I'm not aware of any, but I think the point is that good governance is often measured by compliance rather than by ethical behavior. And I think that this is one of the problems. is that you can almost cheat on good governance by ticking boxes. And we've seen this in a number of organizations, even those that you know, are finished up being visited by the fraud squad, where they were considered to have good governance because they tick the boxes. So it's got to be in the heart, and that's where we've really got to get it into the culture of the organizations through ethical leadership and ethical behaviors.
John, we have another question from Paul Seans.
How do you turn this on its head and show how business success is directly related? That's a good question, and it's difficult. But I think if you look at when you get the PDF, we don't have time to go through it in detail now, but if you look at the 14 statements that particular case study that we showed you has, those 14 statements can be turned around so that you can say, if you've done those things, they will have had a direct effect on business, and they're all ethical things. I think that's about as much detail as I'm going to now.
I think the only other thing one can point at is that we do know historically that companies that have been ethical in their approach to business have very often been the ones that have succeeded long term. So we've had companies in the UK such as Rowntree, which had Joseph Rowntree, who was a highly moral, ethical type of person, and his legacy lives on. And those companies tended to last for very, very long periods of time in a positive and commercially successful way.
Azani asked, "What's the date of the next webinar?" Well, I don't know yet, but we'll certainly let you know soon. It'll probably be within a couple of months.
John, did you respond to Mataza's question?
Sorry, no, I'm just about to. John indicated the group age that valued fairness and ethics. How do you think the next generation will handle old generations of unaware ethical leaders, and how do we avoid any backlash? Well, I think by calling it a backlash suggests that you think there's going to be a negative reaction. And I think that's absolutely right. And that's why I'm really pleading to people of not only my age, the really old ones, most of whom have retired, but even the following generation, the X generation, that they must get on board with this for their own self-interest, because the millennials are just not going to take it or accept it. And I think a lot of large organizations will fall apart if they don't take this into consideration. Paul Seans again. Oh, he's very active today. Surely ethical leadership starts with early talent at their educational stage of life. What work are you doing in this space, and how do you get business on board? Well, personally and organizationally, we aren't doing much at that level, that age group, because we focus on leaders. But I agree that it starts early in the educational stage of life. And I would like to see emotional intelligence as a mainstream subject at the same level of importance as maths, reading and writing, to be quite honest. And I think that the values side would come from that. But of course, it comes from home as well. There is an organization called Whole Education that you might want to look up on the website if you're interested in following it up personally, as they address that issue. Next from Maria. How do you manage your ethical behavior and not ethical requests from the context where you live, the context where you live? Well, it's difficult, but at some point you have to make a decision for yourself as to what you want out of life and what you're willing to stand up for. And sometimes that means taking risks, and it sometimes means being brave. And of course, it's easier to be brave, for example, when you don't have the question of money to take care of your children. So sometimes it's easier when you get older. Sometimes it's easier when you're very young, before you take on those responsibilities. But I would say to people, you know, just think very carefully before you get into those situations. But at the end of the day, there is no substitute for being ethical. Soraya, do you think that a lot of ethical orientation lies in the human heart, hence why some leaders do not want to change? Yeah, I mean, my emotional feeling, I don't have any facts here, but my emotional feeling is that most people are inherently good. And therefore, I think given the opportunity, most people will want to be ethical. But I think that this does come very much from an orientation from when you're very young. I don't think we can get away from that. But I think it is possible to change. And I think it's those people who have the right orientation who have to take the leadership to build these ethical cultures that give the opportunity for other people to see the light. I think, you know, having those base good values and showing them and demonstrating them is a road of education. And it's only within an ethical culture that we can help that education take place. Is there any study which indicates any correlation between ethical leadership and job performance? I don't know of any, to be quite honest. Do you, Danielle?
No, I'm not aware of it.
No.
I think that ethical leadership is something that has, after all the scandals of Enron and the banking crashes and so on, has become something that is more front of mind these days. But we're still in the forefront of thinking here, and too many organizations still place their priority on the next quarter or the last quarter's performance, and business ethics are too often left in the car park.
Yeah.
So I think that this is still early days, and hopefully things like the Washington Ethical Leadership Summit will help to promote these ideas and encourage other people to do more studies. And as we move forward with the programs that we deliver with clients and include greater emphasis on the ethical processes, we'll be able to track the results that are achieved in those organizations. So I think it's a work in progress.
I mean, the interesting thing is that the clients that we attract are either people who are at the forerunners of these new approaches to leadership and the realization of that ethical leadership is really important, or those who are in such a bad position that they've tried everything else. And I think that you know, time will tell. But the majority of organizations we go to don't really have ethical leadership as a high priority. In fact, often the way that we have to get into a leader's head is through emotional intelligence. That is often the first step to getting people to start becoming more aware. Because until you become more aware of who you are and how you're behaving, then it's very difficult to even think about moving towards an ethical culture or an ethical leadership, because these people, you know, it'll just be what should we say? It'll be an intellectual exercise.
And there's another question from Paul here about interest in the topic from tobacco, alcohol, weapon.
No, not towards us anyway. I don't think so. I think there are a lot of good websites from those industries which tell a good story, but whether it's marketing or whether it's really in their hearts, it's difficult to tell. I think there are a few of those organizations that are trying to change, because at the end of the day, if you take the tobacco industry, for example, which is, you know, in many ways considered unethical, they also employ a lot of people. So, you know, they could just close up shop and say, we're not going to do tobacco anymore. And that's probably unrealistic in a practical world. So it's a question of how they move it towards something that is more ethical over a period of time.
And actually is tobacco fundamentally unethical, because if you take it out of the marketplace, you are removing choice from people, but it's how they go about marketing and educating people, and the support they give to initiatives that undo the health damage. There are many products out there that damage health, because you can overdose on even honey and ruin your teeth, for example. And I don't think anybody would say that bees and beekeepers are unethical. And yet, if you overdose on honey, you can also do yourself health damage. So whilst we have plenty of evidence these days that tobacco is an evil, you could say the same about many other things. Yeah. And of course, in the 30s and 40s, it was considered to be a healthy thing and help clear the lungs. So we don't know what we might find out in 10 or 20 years' time about the things that we feel are perfectly legitimate today and that turn out to have negative health effects that we may believe are not so good in the future.
I think that's very good food for thought, Danielle. I think one thing that I would say is that if an industry relies only on legislation and doesn't take the initiative, then they can't really be considered ethical. So if you see industries that are actually making change off their own bat because they see that's the right thing to do over the long term, then I would be willing to support them. But if they're only responding to legislation and nothing else and fighting legislation at the same time, then they're probably not being ethical. And there's one more question from Soraya here. I've spent all my career, nearly 30 years, in the corporate world, all FTSE 100 companies, all great brands who speak proudly of ethical behavior. However, at their heart, and heart is in the fact that they are following a deeper agenda, one higher than money or power. What do you think? Oh, that's a very tough one as well. I think there are many companies that on an intellectual basis and perhaps even an emotional basis believe that they are acting ethically. But I would ask each leader, each senior leader in those organizations to really consider how often they have made a decision for their own benefit compared to the benefit of the organization they're in. And while that in itself is not necessarily unethical or immoral, I think quite often it's not even in the consciousness. And so that is one of the key questions to me, is when that leader is making a decision, to what extent is it truly for the stakeholders of that organization rather than for themselves? And have they really thought about the balance of the importance of the stakeholders in that particular decision?
So I'd just like to thank John for all the inspiring and clear guidance he's given us today, and thank you all for participating so fully, responding to the polls, and also to asking us those questions.